My name is Frank Hodek, and today, December 11th, 2013, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak with respected law librarian Nancy L. Tuohy, Director of Research Services at the Chicago law firm of Clausen Miller, PC. Our conversation is part of the Oral History of Law Librarianship project, a component of the Spinelli Law Library Reference Shelf on Hein Online. The setting for this conversation is the conference room at the headquarters of the American Association of Law Libraries in Chicago. Nancy, it's a great pleasure to speak with you today about your life and career as a law librarian.
Thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's begin by learning a little bit about you personally. Can you tell us about your early life, where you were raised, your family background, and what your childhood was like?
Well, I actually started out here in Illinois, Evanston, and my parents lived on the far north side of Chicago. But not for long. We moved to Davenport, Iowa, and that's really where I spent my early years through second grade. Then we moved to Kansas, and another 3 or 4 years there, and then back to Illinois. So I feel like I'm a prairie girl. Always,
Prairie State?
That's right. Feel at home in the Midwest. But I'm really grateful, more than I can say, and probably more than I realize, that I had a very happy family life and childhood, and I think that's a great beginning for anyone. And I was lucky enough to have it. And our family was, my parents were both well educated. We had good schools and lots of books in the house and a lot of reading, and I was reading at a very young age. So that's from a professional point of view, I think that's where my career started, was reading.
Very good.
And I don't think I'm alone among librarians.
No, I would have
that.
to say that's my story as well, so absolutely.
So then after high school in Addison, Illinois, I went to college in South Bend, St. Mary's of Notre Dame, and then went to law school. Actually, I went to library school. I went to Dominican, it was Rosary at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
here in Chicago?
That's in River Forest, a suburb. And all through, the last 2 years, all through high school I worked in my public library, Addison Public Library. I started at 14 years. So they thought working in a library was good for kids, so they let you start before you were 16. So I had a real job. From my sophomore year in high school, I babysat before that, but this was like with a paycheck, and they took out Social Security and everything. And then in college, I worked in my college library, and after my second year of college, I started working at Cook County Law Library. So I worked there for all through the rest of college and all full-time during library school. And that was one of the things I was thinking of when I was pulling together my resume, is why don't we talk more about the kinds of things that I think lead to librarianship that are not a professional program, but those, the story clubs and the book clubs and the working in libraries, even as a clerk or a page, or putting the cards and pockets on and labels on the spines, which I did my fair share of, or loosely filing for law libraries. I think those are really helpful to a prospective employer to know. You probably know a lot of the nitty-gritty of a law library, just the way if you were hiring in any business. I think you would I look to see, I don't know that everyone does, I look to see, what did they do in high school? Were they, building websites, or do they have, tech skills that I might not even appreciate if I just look at their law degree or their library degree. So I feel that a lot of what made me become a librarian was being in libraries from a very young age.
It wasn't a foreign experience to you at all.
No. In fact, I remember when the first time I went to the Addison Public Library, it was just a little tiny kind of couple of rooms cobbled together in an old municipal building. It was very old, and it smelled like an old library and old book pages. And I thought, I don't ever want to go anywhere else. And when they said you could apply for a job, I really did think this, I always wanted to be a librarian. And my aunt told me later when my mother had suggested to her that, did she think it was a good idea for me to start working at the library at 14? And my aunt told her, she said, it's like giving whiskey to the Indians. So it's true. It's really the only place I ever wanted to be. There was no question. But it was very atmospheric, I have to say. You worked in libraries from a young age. I think you were in a county library yourself.
County library?
So we have similar experiences. I don't know if you ever were in a public library in a small town, but
Not in a small town. I actually worked in the LA City Public Library, which is the public library in a very big town. I didn't have quite the experience that you had had, and so when I was thinking about the profession, I thought you ought to work in a library to make sure that you really are going to enjoy it. And I think what you have said really tells the truth of that.
It's certainly not the only path. There's some wonderful librarians who probably didn't even think of it until after they finished law school. I know some of them, but I also know a lot who feel that they're doing it because they're not quite sure if they want to do it or not. They haven't been there, and that's, I always think, a risk. It's especially nowadays when it's so expensive to go to any graduate program. I would certainly get my feet wet before I plunk my money down. But of course, in my day, in the late 60s, early 70s, you could afford, I mean, I paid for all of it myself. It wasn't that expensive, and I had a job. I worked full time, so it wasn't, but now I'm not sure.
It's a real challenge for today's young person to make the kind of commitment that's going to end up with a big financial debt load, but may not lead to something they ultimately want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that a problem? We'll return to your path into law librarianship and some of the positions that you've held in a moment. But let me ask you, and maybe you've already hinted at it already, but what do you do when you're not working? What are some of your hobbies, pastimes, pursuits outside of librarianship?
Well, I guess you know already. I read. I mean, that's pretty much. I remember somebody saying it was his default activity. I think it was Bob Baring. It's something I was reading, or he was speaking, and I always thought it is mine too, for sure. I mean, before I go on a trip, I plan what I'm bringing to read before I pick out my outfit.
That sounds familiar, I have to tell you.
And I can't walk out of the house without making sure I have a magazine, an article, a book, something, in case I get stuck somewhere. And I'm not a Kindle person exactly yet. I mean, I have it. I figured librarians have to know how to use the new ways of reading, but I haven't embraced it for my pleasure reading. So yes, it's a lot of reading, a lot less fiction than I used to read. A lot of times it's nonfiction, it's policy, politics, or history and biography. But I still try to maintain a little knowledge of what's going on in the fiction world. I like to garden. I'm a city dweller and with a very small space, but it's really something I spend a lot of time on in the nice weather, and traveling and meeting up with friends. It's kind of a cliche, isn't it? I mean, isn't that what we all probably? I don't have anything unusual to report. I'm not a party girl like some librarians, and out there, in the fashion world, or at all the latest night spots. But I did a little of that when I was younger. I tried to keep up, but now it's...
Everyone's life evolves, doesn't it?
They do.
Very good. Okay, well, that's fine. So you've already kind of told us how you became interested in librarianship from a very, very early age, and you told us about some of the jobs you had as a student. I think that your correct me if I don't have this right, but I believe that your first professional job was as the head librarian at a medium-sized Chicago law firm, Chadwell, Kaiser, Ruggles, and McGee.
Right.
And you were there from 1975 to 77. How did you end up in that position? You mentioned being at the Cook County Law Library.
I was, and I finished library school in August of the year after college, so I took a year to do the library program, and I'd been working full-time at Cook County Law Library, and I had some teeth work done, so I said, is there going to be a full-time job here at the county library? And they're like, right now, no, we're sorry, we don't have anything. And so I said, well, I think I'm going to take some time and send my resume out and try to find a full-time professional job now that I have my degree. So I did that. I sent my resume around to all the, actually university libraries. I thought that would be my best bet because I knew some people. I'd gone to school with some people. But in the course of this, I called up a friend who worked at Chadwell Kaiser, that law firm, and her name was Jane Gaddis. I don't know if you remember meeting her.
I remember the name, but
Yeah,
if I met her, I don't remember.
She was the librarian there, and she had been asked to go to another firm, and was more money. And so I called her up to say I was returning a book I borrowed from her in library school, and she said, "Come over right now. I'm leaving, and I want you to interview for my job." And I said, well, I'm not dressed for an interview. And this is, mind you, 1975. I was wearing slacks and a raincoat and a sweater. I mean, I was not, women in those days, it would have been really gussied up. You'd wear a skirt or a suit, and I said, I can't. And she said, no, you always look fine. Just come over. And so I went over, and I never took my coat off. But she dragged her boss into a conference room and said, here, talk to her. And I don't even think I had a resume or anything. And he just asked me, like you are, where did you go to school? And I told him everything. And he said, well, okay, I know when I like somebody. And then he said, when can you start? It was that simple. So I started within a couple weeks, I guess, a week or two, whenever Jane left. And in fact, her new job was right next door, in the building right next door. And my very first day I came there, I, of course, had her on, I don't even think we had speed dial, but I was calling her nonstop. But she said, she had left a note or something, and she said, I signed up for something called Lexis training. She said, I don't have any idea what, nobody did. And so she said, so you're going to have to go and do this, because the firm wants to investigate it. So it turns out that a man named Stu Harvey was running the Lexis office in the same building where this firm was. It was at 135 South LaSalle, so I think we're right, it's right around the corner here. And so I just went down there on my very first day of work, and I spent the whole day with Stu learning Lexis. And it was 1975, so I think our firm was one of the very first in Chicago to sign up for it. And of course it was so expensive, and I was so nervous using it. And I'd never really used a computer. I'd used a few kind of prototypes at the school newspaper in college, but they wasn't like a real computer. And I'd learned a little bit in library school, but I have to say this was my first computer. But
well, I suppose the plus of that was that you weren't the only one. It's not like you were way behind the curve.
No, I think in that respect I was ahead of what everyone else was doing. No one else who I knew was using. There was nothing in the law schools. The county, they didn't have anything like that. So that was in fact, it's something I delight in telling the Lexis people whenever they're talking. I'll be like, I've been using Lexis for 40 years almost, and it's true.
That's a great story, day one.
That's right. So, and they'll even say things like, "Oh, I remember that Ubik," and I say, "Oh, this is way before the,
absolutely.
This was the silver paper and the phone you had to plug into the big console, and it was a dial-up
that as well.
dial phone." So, yeah, those. But I will say, and I tell them this, and I tell the law students and young people I work with, the search engine is exactly the same. It's one of the best ever created, and Westlaw copied it, and it's still the best. I mean, I still use the Boolean logic that you need. I mean, there's a million more bells and whistles, but it's so ideal for what I needed and I'm still using all these years later.
Well, you definitely need to be on one of their promo ads for sure. Let me ask you, so
Okay.
you were at Chadwell Kaiser for several years, and then you went on to become the head of public services and reference librarian at Loyola University of Chicago School of Law. And along the way, you began pursuing a JD degree from Loyola, which you earned in 1980, after which you passed the California bar. So I'm wondering, were you planning to practice law, or did you just always intend to use that JD degree to sort of bolster your opportunities and abilities as a law librarian?
Well, it started out as the second. Even at Cook County, I would read the AALL newsletters at the time. They had all the job ads in the back, and I was looking like Hawaii and Guam and Virgin Islands, but a lot of them wanted a law degree, and of course they printed salaries usually alongside, so it would be obvious that those with a law degree got the better paying jobs. So it certainly put the bug in my head, and I was working in a law library. I don't think I would have thought about it if I hadn't had that job, and that job actually came through some connections. I mean, not anything nefarious.
Loyola job?
No, the Cook County job.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I had a cousin, my father's cousin is a lawyer, and he was on their board of trustees or whatever they called it at the Cook County Law Library, and he's the one who suggested my first summer job there. And then after that, if I'd been lawful, I don't know, I think they could have gotten rid of me, but they didn't. So I met, William Powers, if you remember him.
Yes, absolutely.
Dave Bryant was my direct boss, and Charlotte Stillwell, she was bossed everyone. And I'm not sure if these are familiar names to you, but there was a cast of characters at Cook County Law Library, most of whom were not hadn't gone to library school. They just worked in the business, worked for the county, they worked for the old Chicago Law Institute. So I met people who had been in the business from the 30s, who were just about to retire when I started. But anyway, the ones like Dave Bryan, who were librarians, he's the one who encouraged me to, he would give me his AALL directory, say join call to look for jobs, that sort of thing. Call the Chicago Association.
And you need that too, don't you? Because it's even when you're just working there, you're not really even aware that there is this profession. It's just a job at that point.
That's right. I have to give him so much credit. And I wasn't the only one there at the same time. Lee Burstein was a friend who worked there. He went to library school. We went together. Benning Martin had gone to law school, but Dave encouraged him to go, and he ran the county library for many years. He just recently retired. So, and so there's, and there's wonderful people there. Still Gene Wenger, of course. And so it's a great place to learn. But anyway, that's where I got interested in the idea of going to law school. So after I started at Chadwell Kaiser, my second year there, I just thought, I'm just going to take the LSAT. I really did not study. I mean, nowadays people make a big production out of it, but I just signed up and showed up that day at the test and took it, and then I applied to law schools, but I only applied to those that had evening programs because I knew I'd have to work full time and have to go part time. So, I was lucky enough to be accepted at the local schools, and I picked Loyola. That's where my cousin had gone, and so it was. There was no reason not to go to some of the others, but that just happened to be the one I chose.
Worked for you.
And I was there, still working at the firm the first year. And while I was at the firm, I got a call from the dean of the law school who said, would I be interested in taking on this job, the public services job, because the person who had it was leaving. And in fact, she had taught my first year of legal research class, so I knew who she was. And it just wasn't a good fit for her. She would, she didn't really. well, anyway, I don't want to disparage
It
it.
happens.
It's not for everyone. And
That's
so, but that was a fun experience, having been a law librarian. And you probably had, what, did you go to library school first?
No, I went to law school first.
So when you went to law school, you didn't know about legal research much.
No, it was brand new to me. That's right.
But I did.
Yeah,
I'd
right.
taken really intense courses in library school. So I made a lot of friends that way, because when we were doing those projects and everything, you know, they would all be gathering, you know, dragging me around the library
Sure.
with them to help them. But,
Absolutely.
but anyway, so I knew what was involved in the job, and so I said, okay, let me think about it. And it was more money, and so off I went. And I really...
So you ended up working full-time at Loyola to finish out your law degree while you were
Right.
finishing out your law degree at night.
That's right. And what was, you know, the night school is like 4 years and
Right.
day school is 3 years. So when I was in my second year, I was teaching first year legal research to students who would become my ultimate graduating classmates. And what was wonderful about it is I got to know all the day students. You know, I was there all day. I was their teacher for most of them, and because we had those big classes in those days, we
Sure.
taught everyone. We only had 5 librarians, 4 or 5, at Loyola in those days. It was a small staff.
And yet, many students.
We
when you
had
combine the day and night
3
program.
sections of 75 students each. So, well, I learned my lesson. I mean, this is the sort of thing that all of us have had happen, where we're given a project or an assignment or a job that we probably are way too young for or inexperienced for, but we don't know it. We just say, oh, of course I can do that. I can teach 225 students every day and grade all their papers, and I couldn't. I mean, the papers were just, so I was dragging all the work study students in to help me, and finally I just stopped assigning so much. I mean, I felt like I should have done what the nuns used to do in grade schools, like pass your paper, get next to you, and we all graded each other's. And now I know, you know, I mean, obviously it was, so there was a lot to learn, and I had never spoken in public really, except in like law school and court, and then I was a nervous wreck, and so my knees were shaking the first few, but like anything, again, you have to do it to.
Sure. You all always start at the bottom. You have to work your way through, and you have to have those perhaps challenging experiences initially before you begin to develop that comfort level.
That's
and
right.
so forth. Absolutely. So you ultimately you were the associate director at Loyola, and so you had responsibilities for the day-to-day management of the library. And in all, you worked in the academic environment for, if my math is correct, about 13 years or
That's
so. So before we talk a little bit about your long experience as a private law librarian, I'd be curious if you can just kind of sum up perhaps what was good, maybe what was not so good about your experience in academic law libraries.
Well, because I lost my resume and it was also garbled and I didn't even finish putting all the latest stuff, and I'd forgotten, I'd written an article about this very point in the PLL Perspectives, and I found it when I was going through some stuff, so I read it over quickly last night, but it was along the lines of someone had written a letter about moving from a law firm job to an academic law library
Sure.
job, and what he found was, kind of startling to him. Some things weren't as bad, but it was a big change in his mind. And it was lighthearted, and someone asked me to write a response. So I did, again, I hope in a lighthearted fashion, not trying to contradict everything, but suggesting that it wasn't quite a big deal to move from academic to a firm, and that there were good and bad points of both, but they weren't that far apart, and that my ending was pretty much, don't be afraid to go back and forth. They're both, your skills will, stand you in good stead in both places. You can do it.
It's interesting you should say that, because as we talked about a moment ago, I had my start at the LA County Law Library, like you in Cook County. Then I went to a law firm and was at a law firm for 3 years, and then I went to the academic side. And I've always felt the same as you, that most of your skills, most of the things you do are very similar. Not exactly the same, certainly, but there is more crossover than one might think.
Well, and the other, and of course the firm librarians have, I think, this misconception, and that is that all the academic librarians are just sitting around reading magazines, picking out books, writing a little article here and there, heading up a little committee here and there, but there's really not a lot of urgency about anything that they do. And back to my 225 students all standing in front of my desk every day, and I couldn't breathe. It was so busy. And they were reconstructing something, and they were asking me about, construction plans, and then we were hiring new people, and it was nonstop, for especially the fall, the first few weeks in the fall. I mean, it was incredibly busy. And I think that was as busy as I've ever been in those years at that time. Not to say we don't have busy times in a firm, but what I suggest in my article, and I do still think is true, we have a lot of resources in firms that are immediately dispatchable. You can get a secretary, you can get a courier, you can get a paralegal, or people will do things. People will change light bulbs on your, snap your fingers, and you can get money. You can call up and order things anywhere, even before the internet. You could find people who would ship you, or go and get in a car and go get it for you, if you had enough money to give them. And in a university, it takes weeks to get a reimbursement or a stapler or whatever. It's always a lot more trouble to get money and spend money quickly, and when you need it in adequate amounts. So I think that was one big difference. I like being able, to just snap my fingers and say, let it be done.
Having spent the last 30 years in academics, I couldn't agree with you more.
So but
absolutely.
But there are certainly some compensations. You can reflect more. You can spend some time reading book reviews and buying fun books. Most of what I buy in a law firm isn't really very much fun. Of course, I felt like that about law books ever since I left the public library. That's where the real good books are. But it's very, very rewarding sometimes to be able to spend some time on the philosophy of law, or jump into a course, or take a lecture on your lunch hour that you really don't have quite those opportunities. And you get a little downtime in the summer, and even in an urban school like Loyola, where we had summer classes too, and we would go late at night during the week. So it was very busy over long periods of time, and my firm has never been until midnight kind of place for most people, most days. Certainly there are busy times when you're on trial, but it's so. And you can compare professors to partners, and lecturers to associates. They're prima donnas in both places, as you know.
Absolutely. I was going to say, that sounds very familiar to me.
So I like both, and I will say, initially I was recruited to go to the firm, so I have trouble saying no, just like Ada Annie, someone wants you and says nice things, you think, oh, I should look into this, and often they pay a lot better, and I think having a law degree always helps. So I'm glad from the financial perspective. It also helps when you're trying to persuade people. I think that they know you know something about it, that you can't be dismissed because you don't understand.
You have some credibility that you might not otherwise have.
You do. But I also, I think that some of it just comes with personality. There are librarians who are completely competent and confident, and who don't have law degrees but have other skills I wish I had, and I think are just as valuable, or if not more, technological skills that run circles around the IT departments in some places. So, we all find those little extras that help us make our way in our workplace. But I would say that having a law degree has been nothing but a boon for me. Even though nowadays I don't know if I would recommend it. Again, back to the expense. It's really it would stifle your other your whole financial world, I think, to have to take on that kind of.
You lose a lot of flexibility with
Mhm.
that kind of debt load that you might end up with. Let me ask you now, so you returned to Clausen Miller in 1990, and you were the library director for most of those years, but in 2009, your title changed to Director of Research Services, and the way I understand it, this position reaches beyond the library to include paralegal and docket operations as well. And so I'm wondering if this is now sort of a common career arc for the private law librarian, in other words, to be responsible for more than just the law library.
It was really sort of a self-preservation move, and even in the academic world, law schools are fighting for every student and grant and scholarship or whatever. I mean, the students are a little more valuable now because there are not so many of them. And I'm hearing that certainly from my old pals at Loyola, that people can't afford it or they don't see the payoff if the jobs aren't there. And all of us in firms have seen some retrenchment, fewer jobs, more focus on billing and what are you bringing to the table here every day. And in my firm, librarians and library staff have always billed their time. I've also always been in charge of all the law students at Clausen Miller. And my predecessors were too, who weren't lawyers. So that was kind of an unusual setup, but it's worked very well for us, I think, because all the research all the legal research as well as non-legal research comes through my doors. But when the firm, in 2009 was certainly looking around and can we, have some attrition and do we have to have so many people? Why do we have so many people? So I started looking around thinking, well, I got to justify myself and my people. And then I realized the paralegals and the docket clerks and the file assistants and case assistants and I'm trying to think there were nurses, we have nurses, because we have a lot of medical malpractice cases. They look at medical records, summarize them. They're doing, some medical research. We're all overlapping. The people who, in my staff, we call them research specialists now, they were doing docket searches online, but so were the docket clerks. And, so we had a lot of overlap. And I suggested to our firm administrators that this was a place where we maybe could consolidate. And we could put all of the non-lawyer billers into one group, so it would be easy to keep track of how they were doing, from the finance side, but also we could cross-train, limit duplication, let attrition take care of some of it, and which it has. We had a couple layoffs, but minor compared to what could have been, and it's worked. People realize there are other people who know how to do this. I don't have to do everything. I can get help. We can cover vacations and sick leaves and things like that. And so far, I think it's worked out. And what surprised me, I wrote a report to make my suggestions, thinking, well, it's kind of a shot in the dark, but the administrators really liked the idea. I think they felt that they had a better handle when they just had me to go, and there were all these people, they didn't know what they did and who they were and who was responsible for them, and so it made them feel a little more comfortable too. I can't say it would always work, and another time they might. We're all here on sufferance, so we never know for sure, how well any firm is doing, especially when we're not privy to all of the financial tides that are sweeping through. But
what I'm hearing from you is that these operations kind of mesh together, and it's not interfering with your ability to direct the library, but perhaps complementing it.
I think it's totally complementing. In fact, my real suggestion is what they do is like being a librarian or a researcher. If you're sent off to go find everything you can in a case file on this topic, you're doing legal research. And if you're told to go find out what the judge's rules are in this particular courtroom on this particular topic, it's a kind of legal research. So I really, they weren't all just sitting around like filing alphabetical papers or something. I mean, that's not what they're, and the paralegals too, they're doing so much, that taking trials from opening a file to the trial. And one of the things that the paralegals have been expected to learn, now we're all learning, is some like trial directors, some of these, interactive tools. I think Pat Kehoe would understand them better than I do, of how, posting exhibits in trials,
Sure.
using technology to highlight and illustrate, a particular point in a trial. So all of that comes back to, we're all trying to get our clients what they need, and a lot of it is what I think
information based.
That's right.
Yeah, good. So we've learned a lot about your professional experiences. Very, very fascinating, and it's so nice to talk to someone that's got experiences in several different types of libraries and can compare and contrast. Is very, very helpful. But I'd like to switch gears a little bit to ask you to reflect a little bit on some of the individuals you've met and worked with during your career. I'm particularly interested if there are anyone that you might consider to be a mentor, or are there others in the profession or that you've met that whom you especially admire?
Well, I have to say that I mentioned a few already.
Yes.
Jane Gaddis, one of my dearest friends, she was the one who made me go take that first job of hers. And
I have to, don't mean to interrupt, but what a great story that just couldn't happen today.
And people, they're much more organized, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, they'd have to have 100 people would apply.
Well, but of course, if no one ever puts the job out there, if they just say, "Oh, I got a friend,"
That's right.
That's a Chicago way, you got to know somebody. So, but she was just such a dear. She died about 3 years ago, and she, after I started at Chadwell, because she was the one who gave me all the tips, and like, don't make the mistakes I made. I told them I'd answer the switchboard at lunchtime. She said, that's not professional. You should tell them absolutely not. And they never asked me, actually, but then she said, and then tell them you have to go to the conference, the AALL conference. She said, tell them they have to pay for that. It's very important. I never was forceful enough. I mean, she wanted me to be the tough kid that she couldn't quite bring her, because she was such a lovely lady. But so sure enough, I went and I I wrote a letter and said, I have to go to this conference. And so I started going in '76 and went every year up until this, maybe 10 years ago, my parents got ill, and I just kind of was busy for a few years with things related to that. So I haven't, and then, the economy wasn't good, and I felt like, so I've been pushing the younger people in my group to go to some of the more regional ones. But
we'll be back in Chicago.
I know,
years,
that'll be great.
Yeah.
But Jane and I went to every conference then from '76 till she retired in the '90s sometime. And she was beloved by everyone in Chicago, and she was the one who got, well, one year we took a trip with Babe Russo, who was the secretary of AALL. This was in, I want to say, the late '70s. And Pat Piper, a cataloger from California, was her good friend. I didn't really know them very well, but Jane we'd started out in Toronto at the conference, and then off we went on a train all across eastern Canada, stopping in Ottawa and Montreal and Quebec, and just really had a wonderful time. It really was great. So I feel it, and those two ladies were so much fun and so influential in the association. They just knew everybody. So I feel like I, at a very young age, was drawn into the old timers club.
And isn't that possible, though? It's always been my experience at ALL that story is repeated over and over again, that the people that have been around longer and are more experienced are very open to developing relationships with newer people.
And not really, I have to say my upbringing and family was very open to, people weren't treated like children until they were 25. I mean, you were asked your opinion at the dinner table at 10, and we had big family gatherings at holidays, and everyone was expected to have opinions on things and be able to speak to adults and children together. So it wasn't like I was just so flattered that a grown-up was taking interest in me, but that it was more like we really were simpatico. We had, similar sense of humor. We had interests in the same things. We liked to travel, and AALL provided a big boost to that, to have the conferences all over, and again, not too expensive. Firms and even the law schools paid for my way most of those years, so it wasn't a financial burden, and we really had a lot of fun, and there were so many great people.
I'm glad you mentioned Babe Russo, because of course for many years we're used now to having a very large and professional headquarters staff, and they do great things, but for many years she was the staff.
She was it. She did everything. I don't know how on earth she did it, and smoking cigarettes and drinking scotch, and and I was right with her, and never flustered, and just, I can still see her in those high heels, real spiky high heels. Just, she's a tiny little thing, but she could just stride across hotel lobbies and big, huge conference halls, and get people doing things, and it was remarkable how.
It really was.
Yeah, I know. I can see her now.
Absolutely.
She's really quite vividly, in my mind, how she handled things. But and along with her, there were Cook County. Dave Bryan, I have to say, was the one who suggested me for the current job I have. But he also was my boss at my very first law library job at Cook County, and he taught at the Rosary Library School, so I took a law libraries course from him that was very rigorous, even while he was my boss. So you can imagine, you had to know your stuff. And then in later years, we taught together at now Dominican. We shared a couple courses that we taught as a team. I did some other teaching there as well. But I would say he made a big difference. I worked with so many wonderful people, and I jotted down some names because I thought, well, I don't want to forget. I'm sure I will forget people, but I mentioned Loyola, but I didn't mention Bob Doyle, who was one of really the most remarkable people I've ever met. I actually preceded him to Loyola. There was another.
I was wondering.
He came after I did, not by long, maybe 8 or 9 months. So I was already there. There was another.
So Bob came in as the director.
I know, and I think if I'd been a little bit older and had one more year of law school, I might have gotten the job. But no, he was great, and he was very easy to work with. And I learned a lot from him. And just the courage and perseverance he had, to come in every day and be so wise about people. He was very, he was really good. Things that it does take a few more years I see now, to learn, how, what motivates people who are under your supervision.
It's interesting. There's a connective tissue, I think, in law librarianship, because if we were talking to Bob, I know that he would mention Earl Borgeson, whom he worked with at Harvard, and Val Mustecki, who he worked with at Berkeley, and having learned those things from them, and then he comes to Loyola, and now he's got those skills and abilities, and he's passing them on as well. So it's a kind of interesting to see that.
It is. You're right, and some people just stay put, like me, forever. But he moved from one coast to the other, and then the middle. Fairly quickly in his career. And then stayed here so long. I always thought, the first day he came to work, we were waiting for. And I was pals with our technical services librarian, and so we were just, what do you think it's going to be like? And then she comes in and she said, we just got a phone call. He's going to be late because it's raining, and he's going to wait it out. And we're like, what? And it's going to rain all day. We knew. You could just tell. But I think he had been in Berkeley, and I guess maybe it rains for like 10 minutes and then it stops. I don't know what happens there.
That's the way it rains in California. It rains a whole lot for a short period of time.
But so we were just like, ha ha ha, this guy's never going to make it here in the, tough old Midwest where it rains all day. But he did show up and certainly did tough it out and made it. But I can still remember we had a foreigner on our hands for a short while there. So, and then some other, there's so many local firm librarians who I just have to tip my hat to. It was so informal. There really wasn't a newsletter or anything, but we had telephones. And I remember Dave Bryant, that was always his thing. Your best research tool is your telephone. And so
it's probably still true today.
Isn't it? I know, but and then
although your phone goes with you.
That's right. But I mean, you call government agencies, you call, other librarians, and that's what I did, because especially when you're all by yourself, I was 22 and I was a head librarian and I had to do everything. And so I really did reach out. And there are people over the years, Dennis Kolevsky is one, some of them are real active, you may not know their names. He's at Chapman and Cutler. And Ken Hallecky from Better Price, he just died, unfortunately, this year, too young. Evelyn Giannini, I don't know, she was at, I think, Kemper Insurance. She was an insurance librarian, which is so helpful for those of us in litigation firms. And one of my all-time favorites, Lil Keith, she ran CCH. I don't know if that rings a bell, but she was their Babe Russo, and
Sure.
She was funny.
I actually think they might have worked there. Either CCH or West before she came to us.
I'm not sure if I don't remember I imagine they knew each other at some point, but I don't know how. But Jane and Lil were thick as thieves. They both came to my wedding, and but she was the one you'd call and say, I don't have these pages, or I don't know how to use this book, or you missed a case, and those were in the days, and there's still the days, even though most of us have moved on from loose leaf filing, but that was one of my first tasks at Cook County Law Library, was learning how to be a fast loose leaf filer, and I am fast. I'm still fast. I made money doing that part-time. I know. at law firms, before, while I was still in school, and but it's she was the one who could find anything. A lot of times there'd be like truncations or something not attached, an attachment, that she could go get the editor, find the original documents, and get them to you, whatever you needed. She was just remarkable. And so I consider her, right up there. And then, I'm just going to mention a couple other names of, Judy Wright, who's still at the University of Chicago, or she's just retired. And Judy Gaskell, who was at DePaul for many years and then went to the Supreme Court. And Denise Mahaney was at a firm here, Better Price. Again, everyone's retiring except me. I don't understand it.
You started so young.
And Lee Burstein, who worked at Cook County, we went to library school together. Chuck Tembrink, who was at the University of Chicago, and there's many, many more, of course. But
you do have a very rich law library community and heritage here in Chicago.
I think we do, don't we?
Absolutely.
And even people who aren't here now, a lot of people at least touched down here for a while and then went on, or was maybe a stop in the road of something.
One of the great things in a big city like Chicago, it's always seemed to me, and this was true for me in Los Angeles, is that there are a variety of opportunities all within the same city. So, in fact, you could go from a county library to a law school library to a law firm library, all in the same city, whereas if you're in a smaller community, you might actually have to pick up and go somewhere else to advance your career.
I think it's quite true for lawyers, too, and other, that's why we come to cities, is because we feel like we're not quite so trapped in just one career, we want to change, we want to, be able to grow or make more money or get a second job or something like that. But I agree, we have a lot. And what I like, we're very compact. We're not spread out all over the state. You're the only big law library outside of Chicago. I think the Northern's is maybe half your size.
Yeah, of course, depends on what you think about the University
Oh,
of Illinois.
Illinois, that's right. Well,
our neighbor to the
that's right.
sort of north.
That's right. I forgot about them, but still, it's, there's 6 large law school libraries, Cook County Law Library, the Federal Library, and then all the other libraries that feed into that, academic or otherwise government. So we have been blessed, and yet I hear from Gretchen Van Dam over at the federal courts, and certainly at Cook County, the government libraries are not far behind all of us in worrying about how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to survive? Are we going to be here in a couple of years? Is everyone going to, feel that this is a minor, extravagance that we cannot afford anymore?
Well, and that goes back to what we were talking with you earlier about with regard to kind of looking at other aspects of the institution to see what's a good fit for the library so that it remains relevant, but perhaps doing some what would be considered non-traditional library things, but that actually do in truth fit into the library focus. Nancy, we're kind of nearing the end of the time we have for our conversation, but I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to touch on any topics that we might have overlooked, but which are important to you and you wanted to mention. So is there anything you'd like to add before we conclude today?
Well, just a couple things. This is really more regarding me and my, some of the things I've done, but one of the things I found really rewarding, and again, I have to fix my resume, but I've done a lot of lecturing at different schools. I shouldn't say lecturing, giving speeches. And one of the themes was we want to bring in a law firm librarian to tell you law students what you're doing wrong and what you aren't learning and what you better shape up and do. And of course they don't pay any attention. but what I've enjoyed really trying to bring home to them is that this is a business and it costs money, and that's the only thing I've ever found that really gets law students' attention. I mean, they certainly want to do a good job being researchers, but I think most of them think they're pretty good already until they get there and start realizing maybe I need to brush up. You can just, scream your head off at them. It won't do any good. But when I ask them how much does it cost, and I think they are sensitive to the fact that I'm supposed to be bringing something to the firm. I'm supposed to be offering something. And if I just come in and I'm a big old expense and I don't even know how to efficiently use an online service or, use the firm's resources, and there's real dollars attached to that, or real dollars attached to the write-offs. So I try to just give them a little bit of an idea that this, research and your ability to research is they're tied together. The expense goes with the efficiency, and so that I think has, and I do it with my own law students. I mean, they know I'm watching them all the time. I know what they're billing. I know what they're, not billing. But I also know what they're spending. I can see it, and so that's one of my goals is to make this people very businesslike. And because my firms, both of the ones I worked at, they weren't necessarily the richest firms in the country. My current firm is an insurance defense firm. Insurance companies don't pay like, big, Fortune 500 companies. So we have lower billing rates, and we have to count every penny. And the other thing I try to bring when I talk to other librarians are the costs involved in, the contracts we all sign. Again, I think for librarians, it's time to get a little bit busy about being businesswomen and men. And many of us are. I'm not, but I have seen some things that shock me, the kind of contracts that people are signing with some of these big vendors. And this includes lawyers at law firms. At my firm, I pretty much sign all the vendor contracts that deal with my field, but I read every page, and I hear vendors say, "You're the only one who does that." And I don't read just every page of the contract in front of me. I go to their website and look at all the terms and conditions, and I mark those up too. And you know, well, you have to. I really think that's my job. It's my duty. And I'm not. I would like to, you know, to keep encouraging people to look. This is not just about how to do research and find the right answer. It's a big part of it, but there's a lot more. That it's not. It's not just an academic subject. It really does cost real dollars, and we have to be, you know, very conscious. So that's kind of what I've spent some time doing, and I've done some consulting work too with different people over the years, which not the way I think some, you know, I think Pat Kehoe says in his, you know, he does quite a bit, and I'm sure he's got, you know, some of those big schools. But I've done little consulting projects that I find so rewarding because and I've talked this over with my boss, you know, and he's like, no, it'll probably make you learn more, and he's absolutely right. You know, when you have to go look at someone else's contract or deal or whatever, and I do it through third parties, so it's not like I'm going to another firm and doing consulting, but it really opens my eyes to what's happening out there, much more than, you know.
Gives you a larger context when you come back and look at your own shop.
It does, and so even though I've been in my own shop a long time, I feel like I'm not completely out of the loop when it comes to what's happening in other places. So that's been a real rewarding.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned both of those messages. I think those are two extremely important messages. And as to the first, the message that you're trying to deliver to law students, having taught law students for many years, I don't know how you may. It sounds like you're not sure that they always hear that message when you deliver it, but believe me, you have much more credibility than we do as the academics trying to get that message across, which is something that we do but try to say, but I think they're going to believe it much more when they hear it from the person who's in the trenches, in the firms.
I think, and I think and it helps that I am in charge of law students at my firm, and I would like to see more librarians, but again, they have other, it's not necessarily the only way to maintain a relationship, but I think it really has helped me. But I do want to say, I know that law school librarians often feel that they haven't, done as much as they could have to, shape up these kids. But I know you're doing everything you can. It's just like anything, until you do it, it's like riding a bike. You can sit there and describe in words and pictures how to ride a bike, but until you put them on and push them down the hill, that's when it's like, oh my gosh, where are the brakes again? And there's nothing you can do to replicate that. They have to be there at the firm and having some partners say, well, what's the statute of limitations on this? And have no idea where to start. Or more likely the statute of repose, which they don't even know what it is. But luckily, they can jump online nowadays. That is nice. I have to say. There was one question in your remarks was like, what was the most amazing, change over the years?
Yes.
And so my husband gave me a ride to downtown this morning. He had to go to a meeting, and so I'm reading that and I'm saying, what would you say? And I'm thinking to myself, well, he'll say what everybody in the world would say. The internet, that was like the biggest deal ever. It's certainly changed my life completely, and not just my job. And he's like, well, and we call him the typical nerdy accountant at home, but this was really classic. He said, I was just thinking my first job when I was doing the tax returns, and you had to copy them by hand or carbon paper, one after another. He said, we got a Xerox machine. I'm like, that's your biggest change in your life? He said, it was a pretty big deal. So I guess I'm not right that the internet is what anyone would say. Some people will say it was the Xerox machine, but...
They're both pretty big in my life, I'll say.
Oh, well.
Well, thank you so much. Nancy, on behalf of Pat Keogh and Michelle Wu, my colleagues with the Oral History of Law Librarianship Project, I want to thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to speak with us today about your experience as a law librarian. It's been a fascinating conversation. Your remarks are going to be a valuable addition to the project and be of interest both to current and future colleagues who join the profession. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's just been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great.